welcome to tonight's Thinking. I'm Lara Spirit. I'm a reporter here at Tortoise, and I am going to be hosting the discussion tonight. I'm very grateful to everybody for giving their Valentine's Day to this discussion tonight, and I'm actually quite excited because for the first time, we're going to be spending 60 minutes discussing one person, and it's one person that I think comes up in many political conversations, but rarely comes up so singularly and affords us such a chance to focus on it with what I hope will be some precision, and that's Rishi Sunak, the current Chancellor. I'm going to be joined tonight by Alex Thomas, who is Director at the Institute for Government, and Adam Bychawski, who is an Associate Editor at Open Democracy. I'm keen, I've got a big long list of things I want to kind of get through tonight. I'm keen to look at Rishi Sunak's journey to where he currently is. I'm keen to look at what Rishi Sunak actually believes, and you'll note the title of this Thinking was Who is Rishi Sunak? And I hope you'll forgive its slightly facetious nature, but actually within the newsroom, we've had some slight disagreement about what it actually is that Rishi Sunak believes, and also a disagreement on whether or not he is consistent with those beliefs. So I'm very keen to kind of get into the nitty-gritty about whether or not Rishi Sunak is this kind of arch Lawsonite, or he is indeed the most modern Liberal Chancellor that we've had in history. And I am very hopeful that many of you will join in tonight, either in the chat, or if you raise your digital hand, I'll come to you. My colleague, James Wilson, is in the chat tonight and can let me know if anybody wants to come in. But I think if possible, I'm going to first come to Alex. Alex has had quite a fantastic career within government and was director of DEFRA at the time when Rishi Sunak will have been climbing up the ladder quite quickly. Alex, it's possible to talk to you a little bit about this period in which Rishi Sunak had become an MP, but was not yet Chancellor. So, we saw in the Sense Maker Guide there that Rishi Sunak was elected in 2015. He became Chancellor at 39. Now, George Osborne came Chancellor at 38, but he did it in half the time, right? He got there in an unbelievably quick amount of time. Do you think you could possibly just start us off by explaining that period of the Rishi Sunak journey where he's had this incredibly successful career in finance? He's had what is potentially the most conventionally credentialist path to the top of British politics that you've seen. It's a very well-trodden one of Winchester, Oxford, Stanford, Goldman, various hedge funds. Can you talk a bit about when Rishi Sunak arrived and what he did to kind of so quickly surpass his colleagues in being able to become Chancellor in 2020?
Thanks, Laura. I mean, yeah, and thanks for having me. Yes, it's a beautifully polished CV, isn't it? As you've as you've picked up on there, and almost perhaps by its very sort of conventionality is interesting. I mean, I'm slightly struggling to answer your question because there's so little to say about that period. I mean, he's an interesting politician. He obviously tied his political colours to the Leave campaign, which was the most notable thing about his political career before he became Chancellor, a relatively loyal backbench MP. I think I'm right that he was one of the early sort of up-and-coming bright young things that wrote an article for the Times with, was it Oliver Dowden and somebody else picking up on support for Boris Johnson. So it was a sort of notable early intervention there when he was a local government minister. So his time in government before, it was a year or even less than a year as a minister for local government. I think the most the job that consolidated his position in government was still a relatively brief period of time, but when he was Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and Chief Secretary to the Treasury is a really powerful job. It's an interesting job in government, and it gives you levers into and a route into all of the departments. So the Chief Secretary is the person who sits with every Secretary of State when they're saying, can I have X, Y, or Z for my budget? And basically says no, and occasionally says yes. So I think that's an interesting job to consolidate your power base across government and to get a line into all of those different government departments. So I think the Chief Secretary job is really important for understanding him before he became Chancellor. You made the comparison with George Osborne. it does feel we knew a lot more about George Osborne before he actually became Chancellor, because he'd had that relatively long period in opposition. So he'd also had a meteoric rise, but he had made more public statements, sort of tied his political colours more to the mast in that period of opposition. He'd done the sort of laying the ground for austerity and the sort of sunshine at the end of an austerity programme, that famous party conference where he persuaded with Cameron Gordon Brown not to call an election after Gordon Brown became Prime Minister. So there was a sort of deeper political track record from opposition in Osborne compared to Sunak, and I think he's risen with little trace. The other important point, I guess, contextually to mention is the patronage of Dominic Cummings, which that dramatic reshuffle in February 2020 when Sajid Javid resigned. And possibly unexpectedly from Boris Johnson's point of view, but Javid resigned when Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings asked him to remove some of his special advisors. That created then the opportunity for what at the time was briefed as this sort of all-powerful Johnson-Sunak machine. Number 10 would be aligned with the Treasury. It would be Cameron Osborne on steroids to really drive the objectives of the government. Obviously, I mean, that happened for a little while, but was then with a budget was tested and put under immense stress by the pandemic, and now, well, we'll go on to talk about where we are now. So I suppose that the rapidity of his rise, and then the fact that when he became Chancellor and had the opportunity to really make a political and government mark, everything was frozen almost by the pandemic. Means that it points to why he's still a bit of a mystery in the way that you described it. We weren't. I don't think you can judge Sunak's political philosophy through the prism yet of the pandemic, because he was taking decisions in such extraordinary circumstances.
And that's a very interesting point, and actually it goes to the root of one of the disagreements that we had in the newsroom today, which is about how we treat the pandemic in the context of the political philosophy of Rishi Sunak. So this question of whether or not it's a kind of singular aberration that demanded such a historic 70 billion furlough package, or whether it is symptomatic, like symbolic in some way of a kind of slightly more flexible approach to politics that maybe you don't see through his early writings. And I suppose I am keen to know your answer to what you actually think Rishi Sunak's political philosophy is, because I mean, the argument that there's kind of continuity from his writings as a 16-year-old boy in 1997 against the minimum wage and the Working Time Directive and against Tony Blair through to now, and this idea that his early support for free ports, for super deductions, for R&D, etc., chime with this kind of idea of a smaller, more innovative, entrepreneurial state. Do you think it's possible to look at Rishi Sunak and say he has this coherent economic platform, and were he Prime Minister and at number 10, it would be quite clear where he would stand on kind of the key and defining economic issues of the day?
So Lara, it's Liv. I'm just interrupting. Alex did say that his computer might shut down.
Yeah, he did pre-warn us about that. That's completely fine. I mean, is it cheeky for me to ask Adam to answer the same question? Do you think, Adam? What do you think that his actual political platform would be in government?
Well, I think it's interesting to compare Sunak to his current rival to potentially replace Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, because I think in some ways they are both Thatcherites, but I think in the very different molds. I think you have to look at Rishi Sunak's conference speech, the latest conference speech, to get a real sense of where his distinct brand of Thatcherism has taken inspiration from. And that's his time in Stanford and in California. He talks very nostalgically about rubbing shoulders with the tech elite when he was there, and of course he met his wife there as well. And I think his conference speech is full of slightly crazed ideas about AI and a very technocratic vision, basically, of government that he kind of puts forth, but one that is still, I think, at its core quite libertarian. So I think his kind of version of libertarianism is distinctly in a kind of a Californian big tech style, as opposed to Liz Truss, who draws much more from the conservative US right in terms of her kind of particular take on Thatcherism and libertarianism.
And Alex, I can see that you're back. I don't know if you just caught Adam's point to the answer to my original question about what you think Rishi's politics is, but Adam made the point about Rishi's experience at Stanford, especially, and also, I suppose, his wider career within finance. And I was reading this weekend that one of his favorite quotes is that of his father-in-law, who, of course, is a self-made billionaire, which is, "In God we trust, but everyone else needs to bring data to the table." And I wonder if you think there's that aspect that I think journalists are very keen to cover, which is that Rishi's kind of exceptionally meticulous. He works extraordinarily long hours. He fasts for one day of the week. I wonder if that's a bit too simplistic, and whether or not you think there actually is a more complicated political background to Rishi Sunak.
Well, I'm sure. I'm sorry that I dropped out. I'm just talking to my phone because my laptop completely collapsed. But anyway, apologies. No, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think everybody is almost more complicated than the sort of cliche or the simplistic version of the way that things are reported in the media. I do think, as I just caught Adam saying that, I do think there's that sort of internationalist, fairly Thatcherite philosophy is the one that you can identify with Sunak. And I think, going to the point you were making just as I dropped off, the pandemic was genuinely an exceptional aberration on that, would be my personal take. I do think there's this big question at the moment that we may or may not get to find out the answer to, which is about how much of this is Treasury philosophy and how much is Sunakian philosophy. And one of the notable points is Treasury officials really like Rishi Sunak. I mean, I don't want to speak on their behalf too much, but he gets rave reviews from Treasury civil servants. He seems to fit quite naturally into that data-driven, sound money Treasury mindset. And I think it's interesting that that's been those are the clothes that he's been able to wear quite comfortably, but also have been the source of some of his mistakes. If you think Heat Out to Help Out was a mistake in summer 2020, if you think some of the positioning he took in the sort of mid-period of the COVID pandemic, perhaps putting himself and the Treasury on the wrong side of some of the health data in the short to medium term, that alignment of sort of Sunak focus on data, focus on the detail, coming at it from a philosophically quite kind of dry perspective, arguably weren't the right instincts for parts of the pandemic.
And can I ask you on that question of Treasury kind of philosophy and the internal Treasury culture with regards to monetary policy? I was reading back over his budget speech, and he said higher borrowing today is just higher interest rates and even higher taxes tomorrow. And we've been discussing in the newsroom a little bit about whether or not this is an orthodoxy that will stick, and whether or not our loyalty to this idea of public debt staying at the level that it does or falling will outlast or will last across various governments. And I wonder if that's the culture within the Treasury that you're talking about. Do you think that that is a representative way of talking about Treasury officials and the reason why they perhaps get on with him so well?
Well, I suppose there are at least two parts to that. One is the sort of evergreen philosophy of the Treasury, which for all sorts of historical, cultural reasons is focused on a particular, not necessarily sort of political philosophy, but a sort of, it is the Treasury's job to say no. It's the Treasury's job to worry about the size of the debt and the deficit. And there's nothing wrong with that, or nothing inherently wrong with that. You'd need a force within government to represent that view. Question then is whether the Prime Minister and the Cabinet collectively agree with it. And then there's the broader question, which I'm, others on the call and everybody probably more qualified to talk about, which is whether politics is, shifting to the left or shifting towards a bigger state. And I think that's a question, is whether, and this gets to, I guess, Sunak as Johnson's potential successor, whether Sunak or Truss or anybody else are well placed to maintain that conservative coalition that Boris Johnson managed to draw together in 2019 as a result of
Johnson's personality, Brexit, Jeremy Corbyn being the Labour Party leader, levelling up, whatever else you might want to call it. And again, that's the open question, I suppose, is whether and how Sunak chooses to deal with that question of the deeper underlying politics there. One word, just as you mentioned, the Treasury. I think it's British government is healthy when the Treasury has countervailing forces. And so whether it's in number 10 or whether it's in the rest of the cabinet, when the Treasury is too dominant or too weak, decision making can sometimes go askew. So one of my sort of personal theories of government, if you like, is when the Treasury has authority and is confident, but there's also a confident Prime Minister or number 10 who can challenge some of the Treasury orthodoxy. That's when you tend to get the more effective Treasury decision making.
That's a very interesting point. I think Tortoise published, I remember an article, James in the chat will remember this, but around the time of the budget, Philip Collins, the former number 10 speechwriter, wrote an article which was analysing the budget speech, which said that it was spoken by Rishi but scripted by Boris. And in a sense, I suppose some of the internal contradictions of that speech, his kind of, public allegiance to what you would consider perhaps slightly Thatcherite economic principles, while having a monetary policy that was ever so slightly different to that. I think that's a very interesting area that perhaps Tortoise should be looking into more. And I'm keen to ask Adam about this. And also, before we get on, I think I see Zav is making a point about, and Matt in the chat, about Cummings. And I'm quite keen to talk a little bit about the nexus around Rishi Sunak and the kind of political network, especially when we get into how he might find a way of transitioning to Downing Street in the future. But first, Adam, I think we should address the slightly thorny issue that you've written very extensively about, which is Rishi Sunak's wealth and how we as the media should be covering what, I mean, he's considered to be the largest MP, worth, you say, around 200 million, and has married an enormously wealthy family. Now, many people would say that is irrelevant to politics, and you would make perhaps a slightly different case. I was also struck over the weekend reading, I had no idea that things like this actually even happened in politics, but I think perhaps you might be able to shed some light on this and let me know whether it is more normal. But I was reading that in April 2019, in Rishi Sunak's constituency, the South Tees NHS Trust had a kind of staffing crisis, and Rishi Sunak, out of his own pocket, drafted in a healthcare management consultancy to look into how that might be improved. And the writer had said sort of it's rare for a MP in such a safe seat to dip into their own pocket into the thousands of pounds to do an initiative like this, albeit a noble initiative of trying to improve a local NHS trust. But is that a rare thing for an MP to do? And if you can speak a bit to the piece that you wrote around what the norms are of money and politics in this. You write that Helen McNamara, who was then the ethics and propriety chief in the civil service, had said that she was comfortable with Rishi Sunak and his disclosures. But I wonder, especially if there's anything since you wrote the article that you might be able to speak to, and how you think as the media we should be talking and dealing with issues around this kind of slightly awkward question.
Yes, I think it's certainly pretty fascinating, the level of wealth around Rishi Sunak. To give people an idea, I think I'll just sort of give you a sense of what he's worth. Reportedly, the figure that's come from The Sun is 200 million in terms of personal wealth. He has a quite extensive property portfolio that he shares with his wife, including a Georgian mansion where memorably in one profile, locals described attending parties where liveried staff were pouring champagne from magnums. There's also multi-million-pound properties in London, as well as a property in Santa Monica, California. And a lot of Rishi's personal wealth, we believe, he made while working in hedge funds in the city. So he did, after leaving university, initially work at Goldman Sachs before going on to take a business degree in Stanford. When he came back, he worked for one hedge fund called the Children's Investment Fund, which is believed to have made millions of pounds from a campaign that helped trigger the 2008 financial crisis. Sir Chris Hon, who's the fund's founder, this last year paid himself a record £343 million. So there's immense amounts of money here. And I guess, well, if we're asking why should we be concerned about it? Well, for one, we have to look at the kind of transparency around the companies that Sunak has either worked for or set up himself. So the Children's Investment Fund is ultimately registered according to its accounts to the Cayman Islands. After Sunak left that fund, he then co-founded his own, which again was also registered in the Cayman Islands and had an initial fund of 536 million. That should concern us because the Cayman Islands are one of the world's top offshore tax and secrecy havens. We spoke to tax justice experts as part of Open Democracy's profile of Sunak. And what they told us is that essentially when somebody makes an investment through a hedge fund in the Caymans, nobody can really know where the money has come from. And hedge funds will make the argument that this is a legitimate strategy that's needed to keep their investments competitive. But ultimately, it's basically the best and most reputable way of allowing fairly questionable money in large volumes to enter the mainstream financial market. Tax justice experts estimate that 357 billion is lost in tax abuse through tax havens like the Cayman Island. So I guess the question we have to ask is, what does it mean when we have a politician who could become prime minister that's come through this kind of culture within the city where it's permissible and in fact encouraged in a way to try and avoid paying tax or gaming essentially the tax system.
So I suppose it's a cultural issue as opposed to this question of he's necessarily done something wrong, or you're not making an allegation necessarily that he's done something wrong. And I suppose this idea of he did create this blind trust, right, which is commonplace. But if you could speak a bit to, so in 2019 he obviously put everything in a blind trust, right? And I'm being crude, but says I'm not going to have anything to do with my financial interests anymore. Do you believe that is a kind of requisite and a sufficient response to being able to hold office while also simultaneously having huge amounts of personal wealth?
Yes, the thing about blind trust is that effectively they are supposedly these agreements in which you say, I'm handing over all my money to a third party and I'm not going to have any control of it, I'm not going to have any sight over it. The thing is that there is no kind of legal framework to essentially regulate these kinds of agreements. So essentially we are taking people on their word when they say that they have put their money into a blind trust. So tax justice experts told us that essentially, unless we really have, the paperwork to kind of understand what this agreement entails, we have no idea really how blind these trusts are. There's nothing to say that the person who's handed over their money cannot meet the person who's in charge of their trust and just sort of perhaps ask a few questions about what's going on with their investments. And we don't actually know necessarily what restrictions they might have from accessing or having sight over their arrangements. And of course, if they know what their arrangements are before they put them into a blind trust, how can they truly, we might question, how can they truly avoid a conflict of interest?
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and perhaps one that our newsroom should be considering more. And I think that your newsroom has considered in quite a lot of detail. So thank you. And I'm quite keen to come to Yasmin, who's making a different point about the same question, which is in the chat, a more philosophical question: can someone that rich ever govern effectively a nation that has such inequality? And I think this, I would love to hear what you think, but Yasmin, but this is kind of a key allegation, isn't it, that's been levelled against Rishi Sunak, especially in the last budget, which was, your family's personal wealth has gone up enormously. I mean, his father-in-law's wealth, something like 30% during 2021. We saw that the pandemic widened inequality. Is it possible for a politician like Rishi Sunak to truly understand the cost of living crisis, for example, if he has such personal wealth? I mean, what do you think?
Well, I think I ask a bit of a leading question, right? Because I don't think it's possible. I think that quite often folks that are creating policies, whether it's around things like home ownership or even imagining what the cost of living, I genuinely struggle to imagine how folks who have such personal wealth and who've grown up in a society, like in a part of society that has access to such wealth, can effectively govern a country where people are genuinely living paycheck to paycheck, where there is a crisis of housing. And I think perhaps, I haven't lived in the UK my whole life. I'm not sure if this has perhaps been something that's always been the case, but it certainly feels like it's not trending in a way where the leaders are more and more understanding of what it's like for your average person in the UK. It feels like it's trending in the opposite direction. It feels like the policies are trending in a way that is further and further why life is getting more and more difficult for people. And I feel like in terms of, when I talk to folks who I would say are, generally middle class, I would say that the people that I sort of know and spend time with would, even folks who in any other country, and I'm in London, but in any other city, would, I think, have a sense that life is comfortable, have a sense that, purchasing a house, getting a job that will last, et cetera, these are all achievable things. That doesn't seem the case. And for me to have a chancellor with such wealth, it just boggles the mind. I listened to an interview recently where somebody who was involved in the by a journalist named Vicky Spratt, and she was talking about, she interviewed someone who was involved in the Help to Buy scheme. And when she was talking about it, because she had bought a house on the Help to Buy scheme, the guy sort of said, well, you would have paid off, all of the government loan in the 5 years before interest kicks in. And she was like, are you mad? Like, of course I wouldn't have paid it off in the 5 years. But he was shocked because for him, paying 150 grand in 5 years is no big deal. I don't know anyone that can do that who without inherited wealth or a book deal, right? And so I think there's like a huge element there. I also wanted to, and I put this in the chat, and it's just, I think, something I'm interested in that I don't think gets reported a lot on, but, Rishi Sunak is married to someone who, his father-in-law is like a close confidant of Modi in India. And that, to me, politically, is something else I find quite concerning, because, Modi isn't somebody who I politically align with in any way. And I think things are getting more and more conservative and extreme in a way that is concerning. And to have somebody at senior levels of government that's tied into that, I guess, family and families, that to me is concerning. And I haven't really seen that reported much. So yeah.
I mean, thank you for sharing that. And I think it's a discussion that we've had at Tortoise quite a lot recently, which is how fair game are the people in the highest office family members? We've had it when we've been talking about the remit of talking about Carrie Johnson's role in government or lack thereof. And I suppose this might be, as you kind of imply, an issue which, should Rishi Sunak become Prime Minister, the media are going to have to grapple with talking about or not talking about in clearer terms. I'm keen, James Wilson, my colleague who's managing the chat tonight, but I've just seen you've put a brilliant quote in the chat, which is that one of his contemporaries in finance once said of him that his luck has given him the politics of the head boy. He doesn't understand how much needs to change. And I think it chimes with William Jeremy's point before, which is this question about whether or not he's going to be up for the levelling up agenda fully. And something we've considered in Tortoise recently is just what his true beliefs about levelling up, given his lack of funding in the launch recently, might be, but also his in his budget and in other statements, his real allegiance to, as we've mentioned, super ports and many of the ideas that are mentioned, which he's kind of been writing about for think tanks, especially for years. So I wonder, James, if you have any thoughts about whether or not you think he really does grasp it. I suppose we have these kind of two poles where you might say, you know, he's had this kind of very lucky rise, but other people would say, look, he's worked actually incredibly hard, you know, and I don't think anybody would look at his record and his career up to this point and doubt his ability. And obviously Alex mentioning, which was news to me, but thoroughly unsurprising, actually, when you think about it, that the Treasury and Treasury officials really are a very big fan of him and of working with him. And I wonder what your thoughts are about how you think he might approach the job as PM, as either kind of a visionary or potentially as more of a technocrat that wants to stick to the status quo.
I think perhaps the latter. He's still very much in touch with William Hague, who was his predecessor in his seat of Richmond, and he once described Sunak as very much that he was a modern ideological conservative. So I guess you could kind of interpret that as being in the same vein as the kind of Cameron Osborne mold. You know, if reporting is to be believed, he is very keen on balancing the books, and ideologically he's fiscally prudent. There's a very, very good piece written by Matt D'Ancona from the Spending Review in November last year, where in the budget the year before last, from the Spending Review the year before last, about Sunak's kind of choice ahead of him, or the kind of being torn in two directions, one by Johnson, who you know, obviously wants him to spend, which is what everyone knows Sunak for with the furlough scheme, etc., and one who's, you know, aware of the sheer amount of debt we've compiled during the pandemic, and is very, very keen to address that. I think he'll probably, if he were to become PM, he'd probably govern in that vein. I think we'd see a kind of austerity mark too. I think he'd be scared about embracing this big spending that we've seen start to happen under Johnson. And I think that would actually make him weaker to the electorate. I think that we're living in an age where big government is trendier and more attractive to the voters. And as a result, I don't think he'd endear himself to the electorate.
Interesting. I'm really keen to put your thoughts to Alex, not just because he's raised his digital hand, which we love at Tortoise, but also because I'm keen to know what he thinks about your point, especially that very last point you made, James, which was, are the public now, do you think, in favour of big government? Is that the way that it's gone, do you think?
Yeah, it's really interesting. The reason I raised my hand is sort of I incline towards James's perspective as well, based on what you hear about Sunak, record at the Treasury, everything I was saying earlier about, as you said, Treasury officials and everything. But I do think, in the context of a conversation like this, it's really important to recognise that power reveals, and we don't really know what Sunak's animating philosophy is yet. I always think of the Westminster Village people obsessed with Lyndon Johnson as the American president, and how his record in the Senate was very different from his record as president. There is a genuine question there about what Sunak's political philosophy is, and I think we wait for that to be revealed. So there is a danger in relying on some of the assumptions about where he's come from. And I was very struck. I mean, it goes to your point, Lara, I think, by what Yasmin was saying. It shouldn't be a bar. Huge wealth, whatever you think about it, shouldn't be a bar for a leader to show political empathy. That's part of the job of being a politician, really, isn't it? To do that, whether they are or not, I'll sort of continue my impartial Institute for Government self, but and civil servant that I was. But one of the tests of political leadership is the ability to empathise and then tell the story and be a leader and be a teacher. And I think that goes to your sort of small, large state question. I don't believe myself that Rishi Sunak is particularly a fan of a big state, but I do think that he's, one likes to assume that senior politicians are in it for a purpose. And I suppose we don't know what Sunak's purpose is. We haven't talked about foreign policy. No idea what his views on foreign policy are. Really interesting question to reflect on.
Yeah, and I suppose his defining foreign policy moment, right, has been Trident, but he had very clear constituency interests with that, so it's potentially not that useful as a way of measuring where he is. But I'm interested in your mention of LBJ, because I think as LBJ is a great kind of political empiricist, I wonder if you think that there's much of the same with Rishi Sunak. So I'm very keen and very interested to learn about Rishi Sunak's kind of inner team, but particularly just how slick his operation has been, and looking at kind of Rishi and Liz and thinking about whether or not the next leadership election is going to be kind of run on Instagram rather than anywhere else. And the recent interviews that Rishi Sunak has given have kind of given me at least this sense that he really trusts his inner team. These kind of interviews where he's been asked about whether or not he supports Boris Johnson, and he's he's very slick, obviously, as the kind of very competent media performer that he is. But you see these kind of anxious sidelong glances to his team. And on one occasion, I'm sure you've seen the interview, I think it was with Sky, where he's kind of ushered away when asked whether he still supports Boris Johnson. It was kind of in the midst of the Partygate scandal, and he's not even able to take his microphone off before he's pulled away. I don't know how much you know about his team, but obviously Cass Horowitz, who Anthony Horowitz's son from a social media company drafted in to run these kind of slick operations. Do you think that this slight kind of obsession or increasing obsession with the social media operations of leading conservative politicians kind of slightly shrouds our ability to discern what their actual politics might be? I'm thinking with the Eat Out to Help Out, for example, everybody wanted to talk about a picture of Dishy, Rishi and Wagamamas, but nobody necessarily wanted to, or people did, but I think it distracted in at least a small part from how much attention we were actually paying to the economics of it and to Rishi Sunak as a politician himself.
Yeah, and I can't remember the towns he mixed up, but wasn't there a sort of Burnley and Bolton question or something
like that, I think? And there seems to be that sense of insecurity, doesn't there, with his constituency especially, and even in that Shipman article over the weekend, this sense of him walking around saying jobs are good on, etc., that many people were saying was making them sort of cringe to death. But there's this sense of kind of intentional learning about these places, and you can imagine in that sort of LBG way of I wonder if we're unclear. Some people in Tortoise think they're very clear, but I wonder if I'm unclear about what his politics is, precisely because I think he is so meticulously and analytically playing the political game and doing it quite successfully.
And that it is interesting. It's easy to mock the Rishi signature and probably quite right to mock it as well. It's a healthy sign of skepticism about some of the branding. I think. I mean, you made lots of points there. I think that it's good if a leader has a team of advisors that they rely on, giving them honest advice. I think some of the problems that we've seen in Number 10 over the last couple of years is that either people have been unwilling to give the Prime Minister advice, or he's been unwilling to take it. So, a tight-knit team, but one that is open to outside views and willing to challenge itself is not a bad thing. I think some of the evolution of some of the branding shows that perhaps they've learned from some of the sort of almost over slickness. And I think again on the sort of stylistic point, heaven help us if the next whether it's Conservative leadership election is run on Instagram or whatever, but I think what will be more important is the underlying political positioning in that context and contest, and I think the longer things go on, the harder it will be for Sunak to position himself in the right place, and almost the easier it will be for Truss to do so. For all the obvious points that people have made about cost of living and tax rises coming in and so on. But even on that short-term basis, Sunak has just looked a little bit less comfortable trying to ride different horses than Liz Truss has, with the full-throated loyalty to the Prime Minister. And it just feels that possibly Liz Truss is playing the short-term political game a little bit more cannily there. I mean, going back to your theme about the true beliefs and whether there's an LBJ, bringing electricity to the Hill County type thing. Yeah. Showing my obsession with Robert Caro as people have. But the furlough scheme is an interesting example. I mean, it wasn't just Treasury officials who, from our research at the Institute for Government, who were very positive about him. Talking to people in HMRC who were brought in the room, talking to people in the unions who, in that early phase at least, said, this was a man who was genuinely on top of the detail, genuinely interested in designing a scheme that targeted we can argue about and debate fraud and what subsequently happened, but was rapidly put together and targeted the people who really needed support in a way that was, counterintuitive and countercultural to someone perhaps from Sunak's political heritage. It was interesting that he was, HMRC officials would say he was really, he was into the detail. He was listening to what we said. He got it, and that was one of the reasons we think why that first phase of the furlough scheme was such a success.
And I'm keen in light of that actually to speak to Claire Montague, if you're free, about the kind of differences of being a chancellor to a prime minister. Obviously, we might think we know them very well, but I think it paints an interesting picture about how one transitions from becoming chancellor to prime minister and building a coalition in light of that. But actually, Claire, you're there, fantastic. Be able to build on that just a little bit, because I think it is an interesting point about how perhaps it's slightly naive of us to sit here tonight and try and glean everything we can from Rishi Sunak in his seat as Chancellor about what he might be like as a future leader.
Yeah, I think I'm always struck, as I said in my chat comment, that actually you don't ever hear very much from chancellors beyond their core mission. If you're Gordon and you get given, well, you can debate whether or not he was given it, a brief, at least in the first and second term, to sort of roam all over welfare reform, that's easy. But actually, your set piece is only your budget and your CSR, and that's the point at which you get to set out your stall. And in the current climate, at least, there's not very much you can do beyond economic orthodoxy and a bit of kind of bones. And beyond that, there's no sense of guiding philosophy. There's no place that you can go, I think, as a chancellor, unlike, I think, Liz Truss, having moved from department to department, albeit that I think she's playing the game politically cunningly, as Alex says, has got more scope for developing a kind of persona than Rishi Sunak does within the chancellorship. There's really very little, unless you're given that scope by the prime minister, I think, for you to be able to establish what your set of political beliefs are in that sort of framework of that particular role. There just aren't the same sort of speech opportunities or kind of roaming more broadly, which I think is kind of weird when you think about a chancellorship that works across the full gamut of government policy.
Yeah, and do you think that that works to his advantage? Do you think he wants to set out?
Yeah, because I absolutely do, because I think it means you can put almost anything on what we think Rishi Sunak is absolutely about. And it worked for Gordon as well, because actually it was only what was really interesting with someone like Gordon Brown, who had much more of a scope to move across domestic policies. Actually, when he became prime minister, it became very clear that he didn't know what he thought about quite a lot of issues. That actually almost, you don't run stuff when you're chancellor. You haven't been thought through to make some kind of quite difficult policy issues that you do in day-to-day departments of state, because you're only required really to make decisions 2 or 3 times a year at the point at which you have economic forecasts. So I think we can project whatever we like onto Rishi Sunak. That's not entirely fair, and he has gone through particularly the furlough scheme and particularly the pandemic that is different. But it just isn't a political brief in the way that you would expect, given how much money you can dole out, I think.
It's such an interesting point. And Alex is making a point in the chat that I was also keen to ask Adam about, that I'll ask him about in a minute. But Alex, this idea of it's not a normal job and you're going to have to use soft levers a bit more. And this is a question that interests me, because I'm not sure where in the Conservative Party, and forgive my ignorance if it's obvious, but where Rishi Sunak's natural coalition is with MPs. Like who are his, we've spoken about Dominic Cummings and the patronage that he's afforded. I think many people are aware of James Forsyth's and Allegra Stratton's role in his rise. But I think unlike with some of the other political sects in Westminster, we don't really have this idea about who's supporting Rishi, who's helping Rishi, who's giving Rishi a leg up, etc. And in government, how Rishi is going to be using the kind of soft levers more effectively. I personally can't imagine it, but I wonder if you can.
Yeah, we will see if he makes it, and it's worth saying that not that many chancellors have made it, and those that haven't always had the easiest of rides, whether it was Major or Callaghan or Gordon Brown, obviously, or I think Macmillan was the only other post-war prime minister. I think the reason I made that comment, sort of prompted by what Claire was saying, is other than that very junior local government job, chief secretary, you've got a really strong handle. You just pull. You set the budgets. Work it out within the Treasury and agree it with the prime minister. But there's hard internal power there as chief secretary, and the same applies as chancellor in those key set piece events. You don't. Obviously, I'm simplifying a bit, but you don't quite have to do that steady coalition building, finding allies, persuading colleagues that you do in most other government jobs. And I think it's interesting that prime ministers have sort of, when they're riding high in the British system, immense sort of political power, but actually remarkably few levers. They don't have a huge Treasury engine sitting underneath them, whatever Boris Johnson does with the office of the Prime Minister. They have to rely on their political skills and the deployment of their authority in quite a different way. On the factions, and I saw someone, I think it was William, was doing a post-Johnson fantasy cabinet. I mean, there's an assumption that, and who can resist that? There's an assumption that Steve Barclay would have a senior job, and I think Steve Barclay is playing an interesting position now with Johnson and Sunak. But if he made Steve Barclay his Chancellor, would he make Michael Gove? You want to have Michael Gove in the tent. Perhaps Michael Gove wants to be Foreign Secretary. But what do you then do with Liz Truss? Do you make her Home Secretary? That would be an interesting thing if he's just defeated her in a leadership battle. But you're right, it's not, other than Steve Barclay and some of the other relatively small number of MPs of that kind of grouping who we do think are close to Sunak. It's not a bit like Johnson in a way. He doesn't seemingly have a huge faction in the Conservative Party sitting behind him, which is one of the reasons we're not convinced that he's necessarily going to win the leadership election.
And I think that's the question that I have is he being so effective at trying to tee himself up that we just can't see who he's tapping up for their support, or, which I think is perhaps slightly more likely, he's going about it in quite a haphazard and awkward way because it's this part of politics that perhaps his former life hasn't kind of appropriately prepared him for, right? Like, this is so unique to politics, this idea of teeing people up and building these coalitions in the way that he has, that I just can't imagine this kind of ratty leadership contest in the way that Boris Johnson mastered so effectively back in 2019. I don't know whether you can see how that happens, but I can't see, given his kind of slightly awkward approach to this in the past few weeks, and clearly some MPs not yet convinced by his pitch or what a Rishi premiership would look like. I can't quite see the route through for him to winning a leadership election, especially any time soon. And I saw my colleague Giles in the chat saying, are they going to be patient? Are they going to have to wait? I wonder if you do have anything to add about whether or not you think that Boris Johnson is going to survive for much longer, and what that actually does mean for a hopeful Rishi Sunak waiting in the wings.
Well, Johnson, I mean, let's see. If there's something significant happens with the Met, if something significant happens with Sue Gray, then it seems likely that Johnson is in trouble. I think the chances of either of or both of those things happening are fairly high. So let's wait and see. As I said earlier, I think the conventional wisdom is probably right, which is that the longer things go on, the tougher it will be for Sunak to succeed, but that will depend on completely imponderable calculations that Tory MPs make. But ultimately, can he? I mean, your question about the route to power, can he convince them that he can build an electoral coalition that can win the next election? And that's the ask. I think to some extent that's in Sunak's favour simply because of his popularity. But regardless of factions in the party or kind of coalitions of support, it's whether he can persuade first Conservative MPs and then Tory party members that he can win an election, and that doesn't look easy given some of the tensions within the Conservative electoral coalition at the moment.
Yeah, it's a great point. I've just seen a message from my editor with a very difficult question that I'm not sure that I can answer, but I hope that he can, which is who would Labour most like to lead the Conservative Party? James Harding, I don't know if you're there, but it's definitely an interesting question, and I'm not sure what the answer is, but I'm wondering if you have a good idea.
It's so odd, Laura, because I think listening to this conversation, which is really fascinating, I thought Alex's points just now and Claire's points just now about what you actually get to do as Chancellor, I hadn't thought about it as clearly as that. And probably more than ever, you can say one thing and get forced to do another. Actually, listening to this conversation, I was reminded of Obama and drone strikes. You talk like a progressive and then you increase the number of drone strikes around the world. If you're Rishi Sunak, you talk tax cuts and you raise taxes to the highest level in more than half a century. You have no choice because the country is expecting a level of public services that can't be provided for on your current revenue base. I think that the reason I asked this question to you and the reason I messaged you about the Labour point was I remember hearing a story about Cameron and Osborne sitting in number 10 in the middle of the Labour Party contest and watching the faces of Ed Miliband and David Miliband as the decision was taken. And when it turned out there was Ed Miliband, they both whooped. Right? And the reason, and what I was told afterwards was, they felt that you should always go with your gut decision, and the person you thought was most beatable was the person that you most wanted to lead the Labour Party. And it's a very, very confusing picture at the moment, because in the short term, Boris Johnson is probably the Labour Party's best asset at the helm of the Conservative Party. But over time, where does that lead? And the question I think that you hear from inside, as when I speak to sort of, people in the Conservative Party, the worry they've got about Rishi Sunak is not about his ideology or his policy making, but is he a winner? Can he actually get voters? Can he do retail? And I find, just for what it's worth, there's something strangely likable about his inability to come clean on what he thinks about Boris Johnson, and his kind of wanting to be liked, but also to say the right thing and to tell the truth. He's obviously having out. But for people in the party, that's very worrying, because it suggests someone who's not going to be able to cut through. So the reason I just raised that with Rishi Sunak is that actually one of the best ways of answering this question, who is Rishi Sunak, is who does the Labour Party think he is?
Who do you think the Labour Party think he is?
I think they think he's, at this stage, probably less preferable than Boris Johnson, and less preferable than Liz Truss. And that tells you something about his competence.
Yeah. And I've just seen James Wilson's put in the chat the last poll. I did some of looked over some of the polls this side of the new year into who would win in these head-to-heads. And I suppose the kind of slightly more optimistic support for Sunak is, as you say, because we don't necessarily know that much. We don't know what he stands for. I think it's maybe too early to say how he would perform in a leadership election. But Adam, I'm quite keen to come to you and see what you think, especially because you've done so much mapping, which is something we're quite interested in here, on what the kind of relations around Rishi Sunak are, the team around Rishi Sunak, and his possible routes to power. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, especially, and what you think his chances are for reaching number 10.
I wanted to just say that I'm reminded of with Rishi Sunak. I'm reminded of David Cameron's, what he reportedly said when he had been previously asked why he would like to become PM, which is, I think I'll be good at it. And I feel there's a sort of a similar vibe to Rishi Sunak, that there isn't like a strong kind of moral or kind of political conviction. It's just that, there's this sort of head boy ideology or kind of mentality about him, and that it just seemed like the right thing, the next thing to do. But sorry, to answer your question on connections, I think Sunak is enmeshed in this world of right-wing think tanks, almost all of which in the UK have very little transparency about where their funding has come from. So before becoming an MP, he worked for he worked for the Policy Exchange, which does not declare its donors. He has also spoken at the Institute of Economic Affairs, again, which does not declare its donors since becoming a chancellor. And in 2015, he also wrote a report about free ports for, fittingly, the Centre for Policy Studies, which was co-founded by Margaret Thatcher. So he very much belongs to this think tank world, which in its kind of origins is modelled on the US, on this network of US think tanks, which has been so influential in pushing a kind of conservative libertarian agenda in the US. So I think we have to ask questions about what do those connections mean, and whether, if Sunak was to come to power, he would draw either from policy or from personnel from those think tanks who are, in some cases, lobbying on behalf of donors we have no idea who they are.
Interesting. I mean, and I think that will probably, you'd imagine, become more of an issue in a future leadership context. I've just seen that Heather Gibson, I don't think she's here, but has said that Rishi's parents were her GP and her pharmacist. And in that very, Alex, in that very Cowresque sense, I suppose I'm really interested to know, seeing as that whenever Rishi Sunak talks about, what his philosophy is and how he gets into politics, he always, without fail, sort of says, my parents. It's their hard work and their diligence which has led me to kind of the political philosophy that I've reached. But I think just, Alex, if you can, I think we've only got a few minutes left, but just tee up what you think Rishi Sunak's chances really are of making it, and if he does make it, what you think his government will look like.
Well, there's a big question. I'll do my best. You picked up on, was it Heather? I think
Heather, who actually has said that she can, after you, she can chime in. I hope she can.
Great, because it would be really interesting. But it's telling you can take you can take the civil servant out of the civil service. But the main thing that struck me on that was that he read his briefing papers. So
sorry,
that was the reassurance for me. So chance, I mean, who knows, crystal ball gazing, there must be a fairly good chance that within the next year, Boris Johnson is no longer the Prime Minister, and Sunak is one of the two, if not the front runner, to take over. So I think the question that you've set up and that we're debating this evening is a real one, is an important one. So then the odds must be reasonably in his favour that he will at least have a shot at it. Although cliche time, but front runners, particularly in Conservative leadership elections, don't always win. What would it look like? You would hope, and again in that kind of iron law of political sort of seesawing, that he would at least at the start react against some of the ethical standards questions of this current government, some of the sense of chaotic decision making in the centre. That ties in with his personality and career so far as we've been talking about. So you can imagine a sort of calmer, more ordered, more prioritised set of government activity, and I think you could probably then the test will be whether that meshes with the messy world of politics. It goes a little bit to what others have said. Can you apply that consultant mindset, if that is the way he thinks and organises things, to a disorderly world and a very dynamic political situation? I'm struck that probably the most successful period of this current government was from sort of February last year through to summer, maybe through to the Afghan crisis, when the government had a clear plan and stuck to it around the roadmap, opening up, taking decisions around relaxing COVID rules. I can see that as quite a kind of Sunakian style of government, and so possibly a little bit more of that might lead to more effective government. I can see I've waffled on for too long because it's so.
No, you haven't at all. That was actually brilliantly useful, and I've written most of it down because it's we've been thinking about a lot. But I am keen, before we have to finish, to hear from Heather about your experience listening to how diligent Alex says Rishi Sunak was in reading his briefing papers. I don't know if you're there and can share this. I only ask because it really does seem to be one of the key kind of key things that are mentioned when people talk about where Rishi Sunak gets his politics from. I think there is the prevailing narrative, right, that he followed the incredibly privileged path to the top, when actually if you do look a bit closer, you had parents who were working incredibly hard to try and send their son to specific schools, and not necessarily put a huge amount of pressure on him, but always had very, very high hopes for how he would achieve, and obviously must be sort of incredibly proud of him now.
I think I was just saying I don't feel as bright or involved in politics or anything as anybody else, but I've followed Rishi Sunak since his parents or his father said to me, actually, Rishi's going into politics, we're retiring, we're going to support him.
When was that?
When was that? Oh my goodness, years and years and years ago. So he was head boy when my children started prep school. My kids were privileged. They went to private school. So they started at prep school where Rishi was head boy already at prep school. There was always an ambition about him, you know, and what I find interesting now is that, you know, the rest of the world is, there's quite a lot of privacy about the Sunak family, but they did work hard, you know, so my GP did more than one job. You know, his wife worked, you know, they, as much as you could say they were privileged, the parents worked terribly hard. And I would suggest that they instilled that in him. So it was just interesting when I heard that he was going into politics.
No, it's interesting.
Richmond, safe seat, being mentored by William Hague. Yep. And then through another contact of mine, you know, when I was told that he's the first Chancellor in years who has actually come to briefings with his papers in order. He's read them, whereas all the others, you know, previous ones, you know, they'd waste 2 hours briefing whoever was the Chancellor. So that's just my personal interest.
No, thank you for
just tracked him.
Thank you for sharing. And I've seen that Adam's put in the chat, and he's completely right that all parents work very hard. Most don't have a spare £45,000 a year. And Adam, I obviously completely agree, and don't mean to say that as if to kind of argue with the fact that Rishi Sunak was privileged, but I do just mention it because I often think it's quite interesting to think about these things in perhaps slightly more detail. But I've seen that we've run slightly over, and I'm very sorry to everyone, but very grateful that you could join me on this Valentine's Day to talk about Rishi Sunak. Something tells me that we're going to be talking about Rishi Sunak a lot more over the coming months and years. And if you have any thoughts on Rishi Sunak, and especially on what we should be doing ourselves here at Tortoise in the newsroom to cover Rishi Sunak, to cover the Chancellorship, and to cover the way the government manages the economy, then please do get in touch with me. My email is lara.spirit@tortoisemedia.com. I would love to know what you think and what to say. A huge thank you to both of our guests, Alex and Adam, tonight, and also to everyone for coming. So thank you so much, and have a lovely evening. Bye.